Everyone wants to wake up. They meditate, read the books, attend the retreats, chase the breakthroughs. But Carl Jung discovered something that most spiritual seekers never want to hear. Awakening has a price. And it's not discipline or practice or devotion. The price is loss. Specific, concrete, devastating loss that most people, when they finally see what's being asked of them, refuse to pay. Jung spent decades watching people pursue transformation. He saw the hunger for it, the sincerity of the desire, and he observed something that troubled him deeply. The people who wanted awakening most were often the least willing to surrender what awakening actually required. Not because they lacked courage, but because the price wasn't what they expected. They came prepared to work hard, to suffer nobly, to push through discomfort. What they weren't prepared for was the specific things consciousness would demand they give up, things they didn't even realize they were clinging to, things that felt like oxygen. Today, I'm going to show you what Jung identified as the real price of awakening, the specific losses that transformation demands, why each one feels impossible when you're standing at the edge, and how to know whether you're actually willing to pay what consciousness is asking of you, or whether you've been negotiating with it, trying to wake up without losing anything that matters. Jung's understanding of this didn't come from theory. It came from sitting across from people who were mid-transformation and watching them hit the wall. Not the wall of difficulty or effort, the wall of cost. The moment when they realized that becoming conscious meant giving up something they'd built their entire identity around. And most of them, at that moment, chose to stop. He documented this pattern so consistently that he began to see it as the central obstacle to individuation. Not resistance to growth, not fear of the unknown, but the specific, named price that awakening places on the table and the human inability to pay it willingly. People would rather stay in psychological prison than surrender the things that keep them locked inside. Because those things don't feel like prison walls. They feel like home. The first price Jung identified was the loss of your story. Not your history, your narrative. The version of events you've constructed that explains why your life is the way it is, who the villains are, who the victims are, and what role you play in the whole thing. Everyone carries a story. The neglected child, the one who was never enough, the person who always gives and never receives, the one who got dealt a bad hand. These stories aren't lies. The events they describe may be completely real. But Jung found that the story itself, the way you've organized those events into a coherent narrative with you at the center, becomes the single greatest barrier to waking up. Because your story gives you something precious. It gives you an explanation, a reason why things hurt, a framework that makes suffering make sense. And more than that, it gives you an identity. You know who you are inside your story. You're the strong one, the sensitive one, the survivor, the healer, the one who endured. Remove the story, and the question that surfaces is terrifying. Who are you without it? Jung watched patients cling to devastating narratives because those narratives provided psychological coherence. A woman who'd been abandoned by her father had built an entire personality around being the one people leave. Every relationship she entered, she unconsciously arranged to confirm this story. And when Jung showed her the pattern, when he helped her see that she was engineering the very abandonment she feared, she didn't feel liberated. She felt like she was falling. Because if she wasn't the one people leave, she didn't know who she was. This is the first price. Awakening demands you release the story that has organized your entire psychological existence. Not deny what happened to you, but stop using what happened as the explanation for everything. Stop letting your wounds narrate your life. Stop identifying as the character in your trauma story and start facing the disorienting emptiness of not knowing who you are yet. Most people would rather keep suffering inside a familiar story than face the void of having no story at all. Jung saw this refusal thousands of times, and he recognized it as the first place most people's awakening dies. The second price is one that catches people completely off guard. It's the loss of your resentments. Not just forgiving people who hurt you, actually releasing the psychological energy you've been investing in holding them accountable inside your own mind. Jung found that resentment functions as a kind of fuel for many people. It keeps them moving. It gives them something to push against. It provides a sense of moral clarity. I'm the good one, they're the bad one. And beneath all of that, resentment maintains connection. As long as you resent someone, they still matter. They still occupy space in your psyche. You're still in relationship with them even if you haven't spoken in years. Awakening asks you to withdraw that energy completely. Not because the people who hurt you deserve forgiveness, not because what they did was acceptable, but because consciousness cannot fully emerge while massive portions of your psychological energy are locked in the past, assigned to people who aren't even present. Jung described resentment as an invisible chain. You think you're holding the other person accountable, but you're actually tethered to them. Every moment of fury, every rehearsed argument, every imagined confrontation is energy flowing away from your own becoming and towards someone else's significance. Think about someone who was deeply betrayed by a parent, a partner, someone they trusted completely. The betrayal was real, the damage was real, and the resentment that followed was completely understandable. But 10 years later, that resentment is still the organizing force of their inner life. They still replay conversations, still construct arguments proving their case, still carry the wound as if it happened yesterday. And that resentment has become so familiar, so structurally embedded in their psychology, that releasing it feels like letting the person who hurt them win. Jung was direct about this. He told his patients that their resentment wasn't hurting the people they resented. It was consuming them from the inside while the object of their fury went about their day unaffected. But he also acknowledged that releasing resentment feels like a death, because when you stop resenting someone, you lose the identity of being wronged. You lose the moral high ground. You lose the fuel that's been driving you, and you have to face the grief underneath the anger, the raw, unprotected pain of having been hurt by someone who was supposed to love you. Resentment was the armor around that grief, and awakening asks you to remove the armor. The third price is perhaps the most socially destructive. Awakening demands you give up belonging to groups that require your unconsciousness as the price of admission. Jung observed that most social groups, families, friend circles, organizations, communities, operate on shared agreements about what can and cannot be acknowledged. These agreements are rarely spoken, but they're absolute. You don't talk about the dysfunction. You don't name the pattern. You don't point out the contradiction between what the group claims to value and what it actually does. As long as everyone maintains these silent agreements, the group holds together and everyone belongs. Awakening shatters these agreements, because once you begin seeing clearly, you can't pretend you don't see. You can't sit at the family dinner and act like the dysfunction isn't happening. You can't participate in friend groups where everyone performs happiness while drowning underneath. You can't stay in professional environments where the gap between stated values and actual behavior makes you feel insane. Your consciousness has expanded past the group's tolerance for awareness, and now you don't fit. This isn't a philosophical problem, it's a survival problem. Humans are wired for belonging. Being excluded from your group activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. When awakening begins costing you relationships, real, important, lifelong relationships, the temptation to go back to sleep becomes almost irresistible. Jung watched people abandon genuine transformation to preserve social bonds that were killing them slowly. And he understood why. Because loneliness is a form of suffering that no amount of consciousness compensates for in the short term. He described this as one of the cruelest aspects of individuation. The people closest to you often become the most resistant to your growth. Not because they don't love you, but because your growth threatens the system they depend on. Your awareness makes their unconsciousness visible. Your changing disrupts the roles everyone has settled into, and rather than grow with you, most people will pressure you to shrink back to a size that fits their comfort. When you refuse to shrink, the relationships end. Not always with a dramatic confrontation, sometimes just with a slow, painful fading. You stop being invited. Conversations become strained. You feel the distance growing, and you know it's because you couldn't keep pretending. The fourth price is the loss of certainty. Awakening doesn't give you answers. It strips away the false ones you've been relying on. Jung found that people approaching genuine transformation often believed they were moving toward clarity. They expected awakening to resolve their confusion, to give them a clear sense of purpose, to replace doubt with knowing. Instead, they found the opposite. The more conscious they became, the less certain they were about anything. This happens because certainty, in Jung's framework, is often a defense mechanism. People cling to rigid beliefs about themselves, about others, about how life works, because uncertainty is psychologically unbearable. I know who I am. I know what I believe. I know who's right and who's wrong. These convictions feel like solid ground, but Jung saw them as psychological concrete, hardened positions that prevent the flexibility consciousness requires. Awakening cracks that concrete. You realize you've been wrong about people you were certain about. You discover that beliefs you'd have died defending were actually inherited from your family system and never truly examined. You see that your certainty about your own goodness was covering shadow material you'd refused to face. And suddenly the ground beneath you isn't solid anymore. You're standing in questions you can't answer, holding complexity you can't resolve, seeing shades of gray where you used to see black and white. Jung would have called this the necessary disorientation. The ego wants certainty because certainty is controllable. But the self, the deeper, larger center of the psyche, operates in paradox, ambiguity, and mystery. Moving from ego-centered consciousness to self-centered consciousness means trading the comfort of knowing for the vastness of not knowing. And that trade feels like losing your mind when you're in the middle of it. You don't know what you believe anymore. You don't know who you are. You can't make decisions with the same confidence. And everyone around you who still has their certainty intact looks at you like something is wrong. Nothing is wrong. Something is finally right. But it doesn't feel that way. It feels like falling. If you're in the middle of this kind of unraveling, losing your story, releasing resentments that have fueled you for years, watching relationships dissolve because you can't pretend anymore, then you already know that this work requires more than insight. It requires honest engagement with the parts of yourself you've been avoiding. Our guide, True Self-Discovery, offers 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's teachings, designed not to give you easy answers, but to help you sit with the hard questions that real awakening demands. The link is below if you're ready for that kind of work. The fifth price, and this is the one that breaks people, is the loss of your self-image. Not just your persona, the mask you show the world, your private self-image. The version of yourself you believe in when you're alone. The one that says, I'm a good person. I'm the caring one. I would never do what they did. Jung found that this internal self-image was the last fortress, the final defense, and the most painful thing awakening asks you to surrender. Because shadow integration, the core of Jungian transformation, requires you to face the parts of yourself that contradict your self-image completely. The person who identifies as compassionate has to face their capacity for cruelty. The one who identifies as generous has to recognize their hidden resentment about giving. The one who identifies as strong has to acknowledge the terror they've been performing around. And the one who identifies as the victim has to face their own complicity, the ways they participated in dynamics they claim were done to them. This is where people break, not because they can't handle hard truths about others, they've been handling those for years, but because they can't handle hard truths about themselves. Jung observed that patients who could discuss their parents' failures for hours would go completely silent when the conversation turned to their own shadow. They could analyze everyone else's unconsciousness with remarkable clarity, but the moment that clarity turned inward, they fled. Think about what it actually means to face your shadow honestly. It means admitting that you've hurt people while believing you were helping them, that your sacrificial giving was partially about control, that your patience was sometimes cowardice dressed in spiritual clothing, that the person you've been judging most harshly carries a wound that mirrors your own. These aren't comfortable realizations. They're psychologically devastating, and awakening doesn't let you have them once and move on. It keeps showing you more, layer after layer. Every time you think you've integrated your shadow, another level appears. Jung himself wrote about this in his private journals. The confrontation with his own unconscious material nearly destroyed him. He experienced periods where his sense of identity dissolved completely, where he didn't know if what he was seeing in himself was real or if he was losing his grip on sanity. And this was a man with decades of psychological training. For ordinary people without that framework, shadow confrontation can feel like genuine madness. The sixth price is the loss of motivation as you've known it. Most people are driven by unconscious forces, the need to prove they're worthy, the hunger for approval, the desire to avoid their parents' failures, the compulsion to be seen as successful. These motivations are powerful. They build careers, create achievements, generate what looks like a meaningful life. But they're all compensations. They're all attempts to fill a wound rather than expressions of authentic desire. Awakening strips away compensatory motivation. When you stop trying to prove your worth, the drive to achieve dims. When you stop seeking approval, the energy behind people-pleasing disappears. When you stop running from your parents' fate, the urgency that drove your ambition evaporates. And suddenly you're standing in a terrifying emptiness where the old motivations are gone, but new ones haven't emerged yet. Jung described this as the void between false purpose and real purpose, and he warned that it could last months or even years. The temptation during this period is to go back to the old motivations, because at least they provided direction. At least you knew what to do each day. At least you felt productive. The void feels like depression, like laziness, like losing your edge. But Jung saw it as the necessary fallow period. The ground has to lie empty before anything authentic can grow. People around you won't understand this. They'll see you losing ambition and assume something's wrong. They'll watch your productivity drop and suggest therapy or medication. They'll interpret your stillness as stagnation because they can't see the invisible reorganization happening underneath. Your entire motivational structure is being rewired from compensation to authenticity. And that rewiring requires a period of apparent emptiness that looks alarming from the outside. This is where the question of willingness becomes real, not in theory, not as a philosophical exercise, but as a lived, daily confrontation with everything awakening is asking you to release. Are you willing to lose your story and face the disorientation of not knowing who you are? Are you willing to release resentments that have been fueling your sense of identity? Are you willing to watch relationships dissolve because your consciousness no longer fits the group's requirements? Are you willing to trade certainty for the vertigo of not knowing? Are you willing to see your own shadow, not as an abstract concept, but as the specific, uncomfortable truths about yourself that you've been avoiding? Are you willing to lose the motivations that have been driving your entire life and stand in the void while something authentic, slowly, painfully emerges? Jung didn't ask these questions to discourage people. He asked them because he believed informed consent mattered for transformation. Too many people entered the individuation process expecting it to be additive, expecting to gain wisdom, gain clarity, gain peace. Jung wanted them to understand that awakening is primarily subtractive. It takes away, it strips, it dismantles. And what eventually emerges on the other side is genuine, but the path through is loss after loss after loss. He also found something else, something he considered essential. The people who made it through, who paid the full price and kept going, shared a specific quality. It wasn't courage exactly. It wasn't strength. It was a bone-deep recognition that going back to sleep was no longer possible. They didn't wake up because they were brave. They woke up because they could no longer tolerate the alternative. Staying unconscious had become more painful than the price of consciousness. And that tipping point, that moment when the cost of sleeping exceeds the cost of waking, was what separated the people who transformed from the people who retreated. You can't manufacture that tipping point. You can't decide to reach it through willpower or discipline. It arrives when it arrives, usually after enough suffering has accumulated that unconsciousness becomes physically and psychologically unbearable. When you've told yourself the same lies so many times that your body starts rejecting them. When you've maintained performances so long that something inside you starts breaking down. When the gap between who you're pretending to be and who you actually are becomes so vast that living inside it feels like suffocation. If you're at that tipping point right now, if you've reached the place where going back feels impossible, even though going forward feels terrifying, Jung would tell you something you probably don't want to hear. You don't get to know what's on the other side before you pay the price. You don't get a preview of who you'll become after the dismantling. You don't get reassurance that the losses will be worth it. You just get the choice. And the choice has to be made with incomplete information, in the dark, without guarantees. This is what makes awakening a genuine act of faith. Not faith in a deity or a doctrine. Faith in a process you can't control and an outcome you can't predict. Faith that the psyche, when allowed to dismantle its false structures, will eventually construct something more true. Faith that the void between who you were and who you're becoming is temporary, even when it feels permanent. Faith that the losses, as devastating as they are clearing space for something your current consciousness can't yet imagine. Jung lived this himself. His own confrontation with the unconscious, documented in what later became the Red Book, was a period of profound disorientation, loss, and psychological extremity. He lost his professional reputation during those years, lost friendships, lost certainty about everything he thought he knew. And what emerged on the other side wasn't a polished, enlightened figure floating above human experience. It was a man who'd been broken open and rebuilt, humbler, more complex, more honest about the darkness and the light coexisting in every human psyche. He never promised that awakening was worth the price. He never guaranteed a happy ending. What he observed was that the people who paid the price and kept going arrived at something they could only describe as real. After years of performing, compensating, defending, and pretending, they were finally just themselves. Not a better version, not an enlightened version, just the actual version, with all its contradictions and complexity and unresolved tensions. And that realness, that psychological honesty, created a quality of life that was different from happiness. It was something closer to integrity, living aligned with what you actually are rather than what you've been pretending to be. That's the offer. Not bliss, not transcendence, not freedom from suffering, but the chance to live as yourself, your real self, the one that exists underneath all the performances and stories and compensations. Jung found that for certain people, that offer was worth everything it cost. For others, it wasn't. And he didn't judge either choice. He simply believed that everyone deserved to understand what they were actually choosing. So the question stands, not as rhetoric, not as a challenge to your spiritual ego, but as a genuine inquiry into what you're willing to release, the story that explains your pain, the resentments that fuel your identity, the relationships that require your unconsciousness, the certainty that keeps the ground solid, the self-image that protects you from your own shadow, the motivations that have driven your entire life. If you're willing to let all of that go, not in theory but in practice, in the daily, grinding, unglamorous reality of transformation, then you're not just ready for awakening, you're already in it. The willingness itself is the beginning, and the fact that it terrifies you doesn't mean you're not ready. It means you understand what's actually being asked. Jung would say that the people who aren't afraid of awakening are the ones who haven't understood the question. Fear isn't a sign that you should stop. It's a sign that you've finally seen the price clearly. What you do next, whether you pay it or walk away, is the most honest choice you'll ever make. Either answer is valid, but only one of them leads somewhere you haven't already been. If this landed somewhere deep and you're ready to do the inner work that real transformation demands, our guide, True Self-Discovery, was built for exactly this moment. 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's teachings, designed to help you face what's been hidden and find your way within. The link is below.